after more than 2 months without answers. This new twist arrived at the exact moment her daughter, Savannah, made her first return to the Today Show since the kidnapping. That timing alone was enough to raise eyebrows. According to the latest messages, both sent on the same morning.
There are moments in a missing person investigation that seem small at first. A short text, a timestamp, a name attached to a recipient, a message sent quietly after dinner. But in the right case, at the right time, with the right forensic context, a single text message can become more than communication. It can become an anchor, a fixed point in a timeline that everyone else has to explain. And in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, one message reportedly sent after a family dinner has become one of the most important pieces in understanding her final known hours. Not because the public knows what it said. The contents have not been made public. Not because investigators have announced that it solves the case. They have not, but because of when it was sent, because of who received it, and because of where that communication sits in the sequence of events before Nancy disappeared. According to the source material, Nancy Guthrie sent a text message immediately after a family dinner. Not the next morning, not much later that night, immediately after. And the person she reached out to was not someone sitting at the dinner table. It was someone outside that room, someone she had reportedly known for years, someone investigators are now treating as important to the reconstruction of the timeline. That timing changes everything. Because in digital forensics, timing can speak even when the message itself remains hidden. A timestamp is not emotional. It does not guess. It does not exaggerate. It does not misremember. It simply places an action at a specific moment. It tells investigators that Nancy's phone was active. It tells them she was able to communicate. It tells them she chose to contact a specific person at a specific time. And when that moment comes immediately after a family dinner, investigators have to ask why. Why that person? Why then? Why not later? Why not a family member? Why not wait until morning? Why did Nancy feel the need to reach outside the room, outside the immediate family gathering, and contact someone trusted right after the dinner ended? That question is what gives the message its weight, because the text sits between two major events. First, the family dinner, then Nancy's disappearance. The message stands in the middle. It becomes a bridge between the last known social environment Nancy was in and the moment she became unreachable. That is why investigators would not treat it like an ordinary text. They would treat it like a fixed point, a place where the timeline stops being flexible. Everything before that message happened before Nancy sent it. Everything after that message happened after she sent it. And anyone trying to explain the night has to account for that exact moment. That is the power of digital evidence. Human memory can shift. People can confuse times. People can forget conversations. People can describe the same dinner differently depending on emotion, stress, fear, or self-protection. But a timestamp does not bend. It locks the timeline in place. And once investigators have that lock, they can begin building around it. They can compare the message time to phone records from other people. They can compare it to vehicle movement. They can compare it to location data. They can compare it to camera footage. They can compare it to when Nancy's phone was last active. They can compare it to when communication stopped. They can compare it to the statements made by anyone who was with her that night. And if any account does not fit the timestamp, that account becomes a problem. Not just a story problem, a forensic problem. That is why the timing may matter even more than the message content. The public naturally wants to know what Nancy wrote. Was she scared? Was she calm? Was she asking for help? Was she warning someone? Was she making plans? Was she trying to explain something that happened at dinner? Those are important questions. But investigators already know something important before the words are even revealed. They know she reached out immediately. And immediate action often means something prompted it. That does not mean something criminal happened at the dinner. That does not mean every person at the table is suspicious. That does not mean the message was definitely distressing. But it does mean investigators have to examine the emotional and factual environment surrounding that dinner. Who was present? What was discussed? Was there tension? Did Nancy leave unsettled? Did anyone notice a change in her mood? Did she wait until she was away from the table before sending the message? Did she send it from the same location? Was the message typed quickly? Was there a reply? Was the reply read? Did the conversation continue? Did communication stop after that? These are the questions that turn one text into a full investigative thread. And in a case like Nancy Guthrie's, where so much depends on reconstructing final movements, every thread matters. The recipient matters too. According to the source material, the person Nancy texted was someone she had known for years. That detail is not small. It tells investigators that this was not a random contact. It was not a new number. It was not someone with no context for Nancy's life. It was someone with history. Someone who may have understood her normal mood. Someone who may have known what worried her. Someone who may have heard concerns before. Someone who could tell investigators whether that text felt normal or different. And that is one of the most important questions in this part of the investigation. Was the message routine or was it unusual? If Nancy often texted this person after family dinners, then the message might be part of an ordinary pattern. But if she rarely contacted them at that hour, or rarely contacted them after family events, or normally communicated with them in a different tone, then the message becomes more significant. Investigators build what is called a communication baseline. They look at how often two people normally text, what time of day they usually communicate, who usually starts the conversation, how long the messages are, whether the tone is casual, practical, emotional, or urgent, whether there had been recent changes in frequency, whether Nancy had been sharing concerns, whether the relationship had become more important in the weeks before she disappeared. Then they compare the final message to that baseline. If it matches, that tells one story. If it breaks the pattern, that tells another. A deviation does not automatically prove danger, but it signals that something was different. And different is exactly what investigators look for. Because in the final hours before a disappearance, the smallest change in behavior can matter. A person who usually calls but suddenly texts. A person who normally sends short messages but suddenly writes more. A person who usually waits until morning but reaches out immediately at night. A person who normally contacts family but reaches outside the family circle. Those are not conclusions, they are clues. And the more the final message differs from the ordinary pattern, the more investigators will want to understand what was happening in Nancy's mind when she sent it. That is what makes the recipient such an important witness. Not necessarily a suspect, a witness. Someone who may know what Nancy was feeling before she disappeared. Someone who may understand the background to the message. Someone who may have been part of a longer conversation Nancy had been having in private. Someone who may know whether Nancy was worried about a person, a decision, a document, a family issue, a financial matter, or something she did not want to discuss in front of others. That is why investigators would not only ask about the final text. They would ask about the relationship. They would ask how long they had known each other. They would ask how often they communicated. They would ask what Nancy had talked about in the weeks before the dinner. They would ask whether Nancy seemed afraid. They would ask whether she seemed pressured. They would ask whether she mentioned family tension. They would ask whether she mentioned property, money, plans, disagreements, or concerns about her safety. Because the final text may not be the beginning of the story. It may be the continuation of one. That is a crucial point. Sometimes the last message only makes sense when investigators understand the messages that came before it. A sentence that sounds casual to the public may carry deeper meaning between two people. A simple, "call me when you can," may mean something very different if the recipient knows Nancy only wrote that when she was upset. A short, "I need to talk," may not reveal much by itself, but if it follows weeks of worry, it becomes important. A message that appears calm may still be urgent if it is out of pattern. That is why investigators reportedly reviewed the communication history between Nancy and the recipient. Not just the final message, but the larger thread. They needed context, because context is what turns words into evidence. The digital record can show the message existed, but the relationship can explain why it mattered, and that is where the case becomes more human. Behind every forensic timeline is a person making choices. Nancy picked up her phone. Nancy chose that recipient. Nancy sent that message. Whatever she wrote, it was important enough to send at that moment, and that choice belongs to Nancy. In a case filled with other people's movements, other people's statements, other people's digital activity, this text stands apart because it is Nancy's own action, her voice in the record, her decision, her attempt to communicate after the dinner and before the unknown. That is why investigators may view it as one of the clearest windows into Nancy's final known state of mind. Not perfect, not complete, but direct. Because it came from her, that matters deeply. Most of the evidence in a case like this is about what happened around the victim, who moved where, who deleted what, who called whom, who had access, who changed behavior, who became silent, who owned property, who appeared in a timeline. But Nancy's final text is different. It tells investigators what Nancy did. It shows that she was active, that she was thinking, that she had a reason to reach out, that before the silence she communicated. That one fact can reshape the emotional center of the case, because it suggests Nancy may have understood something was wrong. Maybe not fully, maybe not in a way she could prove, maybe only as a feeling, a concern, a reaction to something that had just happened. but enough to reach out, enough to send a message to someone outside the family gathering. And that is why the dinner itself becomes so important. Family dinners can look ordinary from the outside. People sit together, they talk, they eat, they smile, they leave. But investigators know that the final social setting before a disappearance can contain important clues. The emotional temperature of that room matters. Was the conversation calm? Was it tense? Was there an argument? Was Nancy quiet? Did she appear distracted? Did anyone leave early? Did anyone follow her afterward? Did anyone ask about her plans? Did anyone know where she was going next? Did anyone notice she was uncomfortable? The answers may seem small, but small answers can reconstruct a night. If Nancy sent the text immediately after leaving that environment, investigators would want to know whether the dinner triggered the message. Maybe it did. Maybe it did not. But the timing makes the question unavoidable. And that is what this investigation appears to be doing, turning unavoidable questions into a timeline. The message is an anchor. The dinner is the setting before the anchor. The disappearance is the event after the anchor. And between those points, investigators are searching for meaning. The meaning may be in the words Nancy wrote. It may be in the person she chose. It may be in the reply she received. It may be in the fact that the message happened at all. It may be in the difference between Nancy's normal communication pattern and that one urgent moment after dinner. This is why deleted communications would matter so much. If any part of that thread was deleted, investigators would treat the deletion as its own event. When was it deleted? From whose device? Before or after Nancy disappeared? Was it deleted manually? Was it deleted from one phone or both? Was it backed up in the cloud? Was the recipient's device available? Was Nancy's device available? Did the deletion happen during a window when someone else may have had access? Deletion does not automatically mean guilt. People delete messages for many reasons: privacy, fear, confusion, bad advice, panic, embarrassment. But in a missing person case, deleting communication with the missing person shortly before they disappeared is never meaningless. It becomes a question investigators have to answer. And if Nancy's phone showed deleted messages after she was no longer available to operate it, then the implications would become even more serious. Who had access? Who touched the phone? Who knew the passcode? Who wanted the thread gone? Again, these are not conclusions. They are investigative questions. And the value of this final text is that it creates questions with direction. It does not float in the case. It points. It points to the dinner. It points to the recipient. It points to Nancy's state of mind. It points to the timeline. It points to what investigators still need to know. By this stage, the investigation was reportedly already examining several major evidence tracks: physical evidence, digital reconstruction, communications, financial activity, property-related questions, and timeline gaps. The source material places Nancy's final text inside that broader web, describing it as one of the fixed points investigators may be using to reconstruct what happened in her final known hours. That is what makes it so powerful. The physical evidence can tell investigators what may have happened. The digital evidence can tell them where people may have been. The financial evidence can suggest pressure or motive. The property evidence can show concealment or access. But Nancy's message may tell them what she knew, or at least what she felt needed to be said. And that may be the missing layer. Because motive and movement explain one side of the case. Nancy's own words may explain the other. What did she sense? What did she fear? What did she want this person to know? Why did she not wait? Why did she send the message immediately? Those questions are the heartbeat of this part of the story. And until the full meaning of that text is known, the timeline remains incomplete. The final text did not become important because of one sentence alone. It became important because of where it sits, between the dinner and the disappearance, between the last social setting and the first stretch of silence, between what Nancy Guthrie may have experienced that evening and what investigators are still trying to prove happened after. That is why investigators do not look at a final message as a single isolated event. They place it inside the full structure of the night. They compare it to every known movement, every known call, every known location point, every device record, every statement, every gap, and every person who was present before or after that message was sent. Because in a case like this, the text itself may be private, but the timing is not silent. The timing speaks. And if Nancy sent that message immediately after leaving a family dinner, then investigators have to ask what happened in that room that made her reach out. It may have been nothing dramatic. It may not have been an argument. It may not have been a threat. It may not have been something anyone else at the table even noticed. But something about that moment mattered enough that Nancy picked up her phone and contacted someone outside the family gathering. That one decision changed the timeline. Because it showed that Nancy was alive after the dinner. It showed that her phone was active. It showed that she was choosing who to contact. And it showed that whatever happened next did not erase the fact that Nancy had already created a digital marker that investigators could return to again and again. That is why the recipient becomes so important. Not because receiving a message makes someone guilty, it does not. Not because knowing Nancy makes someone suspicious, it does not. But because the person on the other end of that message may understand something no forensic tool can fully explain. They may understand Nancy's tone. They may understand her habits. They may know whether she usually reached out after family gatherings. They may know whether she was worried in the days before that dinner. They may know whether the message sounded normal, cautious, anxious, urgent, or unlike her. And in a missing person investigation, that kind of human context can be just as important as the digital record itself. The phone can prove that a message was sent. The recipient may help explain why. Investigators reportedly reviewed the relationship history between Nancy and the person she contacted. That means they were not only focused on the final text. They were likely looking at the whole pattern, past messages, earlier calls, timing, tone, and whether Nancy had been discussing concerns before that night. That is how communication forensics works. It builds a baseline, a normal pattern. How often did Nancy contact this person? Did she usually text or call? Did she usually reach out during the day or at night? Were their conversations practical, emotional, friendly, or urgent? Did the communication increase in the weeks before her disappearance? Did Nancy begin sharing things she had not shared before? Did she mention stress? Did she mention family tension? Did she mention property? Did she mention financial decisions? Did she mention fear? These questions matter because the final message can only be understood properly when investigators know what came before it. A message that looks simple to the public may carry private meaning between two people who have years of history. One short line may sound ordinary to everyone else, but to the recipient, it may have meant Nancy was unsettled. A phrase like, "I need to talk," can mean nothing in one relationship and everything in another. A message that appears calm may actually be urgent if Nancy never sent messages that way. That is why investigators would compare the final text against months of communication if they could. They would want to know whether this message was part of a longer conversation. Because if Nancy had been confiding in this person before the dinner, then the post-dinner text may not be the beginning of the story. It may be the continuation, and that continuation could be vital. Because the dinner did not happen in a vacuum. No final night ever does. By the time a person disappears, there is often a buildup that only becomes visible afterward. A strained conversation, a decision someone did not agree with, a family disagreement, a financial concern, a change in routine, a feeling that something was wrong. At the time, those moments may look small. After the disappearance, they become evidence of atmosphere. That is what investigators would be trying to reconstruct around Nancy. Not just where she went, but what she was feeling, what she knew, what she feared, who she trusted enough to contact when the dinner ended, and whether the person she reached out to understood the deeper meaning behind that message. The dinner itself becomes central because it was reportedly the last known family environment before the disappearance. In any investigation, the final social environment matters because it may contain the emotional trigger for what followed. Investigators would want to know who sat at that table, who spoke to Nancy, what was discussed, whether anyone raised money, whether anyone raised property, whether anyone mentioned plans, whether Nancy looked uncomfortable, whether she was quiet, whether she left earlier than expected, whether she appeared calm when she departed, whether anyone followed up with her afterward, whether anyone else used their phone around the same time, whether the mood of the dinner changed before it ended. These details can seem ordinary to people who were there. But investigators are trained to take ordinary details and place them under pressure. A person's expression, a silence, a sudden departure, a comment that seemed harmless at the time, a private text sent immediately afterward. Together, those details may show that the dinner created a reaction in Nancy. And if the dinner created a reaction, then the dinner is not just background. It becomes part of the chain. That is why the word immediately matters so much in the source material. Nancy did not wait until the next day. She did not wait until the memory faded. She did not sleep on it. She acted right away. Immediate action often suggests emotional momentum. Something was fresh. Something was active in her mind. Something made her choose that person at that moment. Again, this does not prove what happened at the dinner. It does not prove anyone at the dinner harmed her. It does not prove the recipient knew anything criminal. But it tells investigators that the dinner and the message must be examined together. One follows the other too closely to ignore. And when investigators begin building the timeline, that message becomes a fixed marker. The dinner ends. Nancy sends the text. Then the timeline moves toward disappearance. That order matters, because every statement about the night has to fit around it. If someone says Nancy seemed perfectly normal after dinner, investigators compare that to the fact that she immediately reached out to someone outside the family. If someone says nothing unusual happened, investigators ask why the message was sent right then. If someone says Nancy went straight home, investigators look at the phone location. If someone says they did not contact her again, investigators compare that to call logs. If someone says they do not remember the timing, investigators compare it to the timestamp. The timestamp does not need memory. It is already recorded. That is why the message is so powerful. It reduces the room for vague explanations. It gives investigators a point that cannot easily be moved. And once that point is locked in place, everything else either fits or it does not. The recipient's response also matters. Did they reply? How quickly? Was the reply read? Did Nancy respond again? Did the conversation stop abruptly? Did the recipient call her? Did they try to follow up when she did not answer later? Did they tell anyone about the message before investigators contacted them? Did they preserve the thread? Did they delete anything? Did they give investigators the phone willingly? These are important questions because a final communication is not only about what the missing person sent. It is also about what happened next. A reply can show whether Nancy was still engaged. A read receipt can show whether she saw the answer. A missed call can show concern. A lack of follow-up can raise questions. A deletion can become a separate forensic event. The source material highlights that investigators may examine deleted communications, device backups, metadata, and message history because even deleted threads can sometimes be recovered through forensic tools or cloud backups. That detail matters because deletion changes the meaning of the thread. Not every deletion is criminal. People delete messages for privacy. People panic. People worry about being misunderstood. People may delete conversations before they realize they matter. But when a missing person's final message is involved, deletion becomes something investigators must explain. When was it deleted? Who deleted it? From which device? Before Nancy disappeared? After Nancy disappeared? Was it deleted from Nancy's phone, the recipient's phone, or both? Was it preserved in a backup? Was it recoverable from a cloud service? Did someone access Nancy's device after she was gone? These questions can open an entirely new branch of the investigation, because deleting a message may not destroy evidence, it may create more. The act of deletion can have a timestamp. It can show device access, it can show intent, it can show that someone knew the thread mattered. And if someone tried to remove the conversation after Nancy disappeared, investigators would want to know why. That is where digital forensics becomes more than technology. It becomes behavior. A phone records not only what people say, but what they try to hide. It records the moment a message is sent, the moment it is delivered, the moment it is opened, the moment it is deleted. The device used, the backup created, the account connected, the network accessed, all of those details create a map. And in Nancy's case, investigators appear to be using that map to reconstruct the final hours around the dinner, the message, and the disappearance. The recipient, if cooperative, could help make sense of what the records show. They could tell investigators whether Nancy sounded worried. They could explain inside references. They could identify names Nancy may have used privately. They could explain whether Nancy had been building toward a decision. They could say whether she had mentioned concerns in earlier conversations. They could provide emotional context that metadata cannot provide. But if the recipient withheld information, avoided clarity, deleted messages, or minimized what Nancy said, investigators would not simply move on. They would use tools, subpoenas, device warrants, cloud records, carrier data, interviews, cross-references. They would compare what the recipient said with what the device proved. Because in a federal timeline reconstruction, every person connected to a final communication becomes important, not because they are guilty, because they are close to the truth. The text also raises another question that sits beneath the entire case. Why did Nancy reach outside the family? That does not mean she did not love her family. It does not mean the family gathering was hostile. It does not mean every person at the dinner should be treated as suspicious. But in that specific moment, after leaving that specific environment, Nancy's first action was reportedly to contact someone else. Someone not at the table, someone with history, someone she trusted. That choice may reveal where Nancy felt safe enough to speak. And that is important, because people often reveal fear in private before they reveal it publicly. They may not confront someone directly. They may not accuse. They may not write a detailed explanation. They may simply reach for the person they believe will understand, a friend, a confidant, someone outside the pressure of the room. someone who knows how they sound when something is wrong. That may be why investigators are treating the recipient as a key part of the timeline. The person may not only have received a message, they may have received the last piece of Nancy's perspective before the case turned dark. And Nancy's perspective matters, because so much of the investigation is about other people, other people's movements, other people's phone records, other people's explanations, other people's possible access, other people's silence. But this text is Nancy's action. It is Nancy's hand on the phone, Nancy's decision to send, Nancy's choice of recipient, Nancy's timing, her voice even if the public has not heard the words. That gives the message a different emotional weight. It is not speculation from outsiders. It is not a theory created after the fact. It is something Nancy herself did before she disappeared. That is why investigators would place it beside the other major evidence tracks. The physical evidence may show what happened after. The digital evidence may show who moved where. The financial evidence may suggest pressure or motive. The property evidence may show concealment. But the final text may show what Nancy knew before the silence. That is the piece no one can afford to overlook. If the message was distressed, it could show fear. If it was calm but urgent, it could show controlled concern. If it was ordinary, its timing still demands explanation. If it referenced someone or something from the dinner, it could become a direct link to what happened that evening. If it asked the recipient to call or meet, investigators would need to know whether that plan was interrupted. If it mentioned a concern Nancy had raised before, it could prove that the final hours were part of a longer pattern. And if it was deleted, the deletion itself could become evidence that someone understood its importance. This is why the investigation around the final text cannot be rushed. The public may want the words. They may want the recipient's name. They may want a simple answer. But investigators need more than curiosity. They need proof. They need the full thread. They need the devices. They need metadata. They need the timing. They need the reply. They need the history. They need the dinner timeline. They need the location records. They need the statements from everyone present. They need to know whether Nancy's message aligns with other evidence or whether it exposes contradictions. That is how a final text becomes a key, not because it unlocks everything instantly, but because it tells investigators where to turn next. If Nancy's message points back to the dinner, they return to the people at the dinner. If it points to a concern she had shared before, they return to the earlier messages. If it points to a person, they examine that person's timeline. If it points to fear, they examine who or what created that fear. If it points to arrangements, they examine whether those arrangements were interrupted. The message becomes a direction. And direction is what investigators need in a case filled with overlapping evidence. By this stage of the investigation, according to the source material, there were already multiple threads being examined: digital timelines, physical evidence, communications, property questions, financial activity, and possible recovered material. The final text stands out because it may represent Nancy's own final known communication inside that wider evidentiary picture. That is what makes it different. It is not just about what others did around Nancy. It is about what Nancy did for herself. She reached out. She chose someone. She left a marker. And now investigators are trying to understand the meaning of that marker. There is also an emotional burden on the recipient that cannot be ignored. Imagine receiving a message from someone you have known for years. You read it, maybe reply, maybe plan to speak later, maybe think nothing more of it at the moment. Then that person disappears. Suddenly, the message is no longer just a message. It becomes the last known connection, the last known words, the last sign of what she may have been thinking. The recipient may replay it again and again. What did she mean? Was there something I missed? Should I have called sooner? Should I have told someone immediately? Could that message have changed anything? That emotional weight is real. But investigators cannot rely on emotion alone. They have to gather what can be proven. They have to know whether the recipient preserved the message, whether they gave investigators the full context, whether they understood its importance, whether they recognized any reference inside it, whether Nancy had shared similar concerns before, whether the message was the final piece of a conversation that had been building for weeks. That is why the recipient may become one of the most important witnesses in the case. Because witnesses do not always see a crime. Sometimes they hold context. Sometimes they hold the last ordinary contact before everything changes. Sometimes they are the only person who knows whether the victim sounded afraid. And in Nancy's case, that context could help investigators understand whether the dinner was simply the last family gathering, or whether it was the moment that pushed Nancy to communicate something she could not say in the room. That question remains at the center. What did Nancy feel after that dinner? What did she know? What did she want this person to understand? Was she documenting something? Was she seeking reassurance? Was she asking for help? Was she continuing a private conversation that had already begun before that night? Or was she simply reaching out like she had many times before, unaware that this would become one of the last fixed points in her life? Investigators have to hold all of those possibilities at once. They cannot assume the most dramatic version. They cannot dismiss the timing either. They must let the evidence decide. And the evidence starts with the timestamp.